Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to unpick the sometimes baffling statement that Labour leader Keir Starmer made in an interview yesterday regarding the various NHS policies that Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeton has been discussing in recent months. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So after discussing the latest on the Tories' plans to destroy the NHS yesterday, what have Labour announced to fix it? Not be easy. In fact, yesterday I was reminded that it was the 22nd anniversary of Tony Blair announcing the plan to get healthcare investment up to the average level of the EU within 6 years, he said at the time. That's how badly the EU had been run down by the previous Tory government. It needed a plan that would take years just to bring our healthcare system investment up to the average level in the EU. How much worse will the situation be when this Tory government are removed? As it happens, Labour did exceed their investment targets, but it still took years to reverse that Tory decline. So the task for the next Labour government is going to be quite ponderous. As well as just investing more money, there's going to need to be reforms that go beyond just reversing what the Tories have done, and people are quite rightly suspicious of those reforms when you consider that not all of the investment was there. You know, the performance of the NHS was there under the last Labour government, but I mean, I was not a fan of PFI, I have to say. So people are a little bit cynical, which is reasonable. Because reforms have been announced. I don't think they've always been communicated in the best way. The most eye-opening statement from Starmer yesterday was self-referrals. He suggested that people don't always need to go to the GP just to be passed on to a specialist when they could just refer themselves. You what, mate? There was a particularly baffling example related to like finding bleeding. It's like, well, I mean, this is a bit confusing. You don't refer yourself to, like, if I've got bleeding that might be of immediate concern, I don't go to see the GP anyway. I'm not going to bleed out for 2 weeks while I wait for my appointment. I go to A&E. And if it's like bleeding in your stool or something, well, yes, you do go to a GP. And yes, they may refer you to a specialist. But how are you going to do that? How do you refer yourself? You know, even if you're allowed to, do you refer yourself to a proctologist, an oncologist? What do you do? How are you going to know? And what if you've just got hemorrhoids? Imagine already overworked consultants working through a backlog of people who've just got piles, could have been told as much by the GP. While people who possibly have got cancer are stuck in longer waiting times to see the specialist because there's people ahead of them who just need a bit of preparation H. What a stupid bloody idea. And the Daily Mail were quick to ridicule it today, of course. So why come out with this nonsense? Well, it's not a policy, thankfully. Hopefully never will be. My concern isn't that Labour would ever try to realise such a concept, because that's ridiculous. What I found most worrying is that actually it's the sort of thing that gives the Tories ideas about how to make the NHS even less efficient. Oh, self-referrals, brilliant. We'll probably have it as government policy next year. So why did Starmer do it? Well, it's not the best example of this, but it's part of the normal election narrative that Labour have to engage in if they want to win. This was just a particularly surreal example that I hope they are rethinking. When the Tories want to win power, they have a problem. See, voters in the UK sort of understand the need for good public services, so an election campaign has to include offers in this regard. The Tories always claim that they will improve public services. Of course they will. They want to win the election. They're making that task more difficult if they come out and say, no, we actually want to run public services down. But they also claim they're going to make public services better by investing less money. Well, that doesn't make sense, does it? How does that work? Efficiency savings. It's their trump card every time. Efficiency savings. Oh, so much waste, so much waste. We could do better with less money. They and their client media constantly feed the general population a diet of stories about inefficiencies throughout our national infrastructure. They'll make things better for less money by improving efficiency. And because the Tory press are so influential, Labour have to play the same game. Not a problem, really. This particular political aim is not a problem, because all people really want to see is the improved public services, which Labour deliver. You know, this notion of referrals is just feeding into that narrative. Like, well, imagine if you could just bypass this bit of bureaucracy. Oh, you don't like the bureaucracy, do we? You'd save yourself time. You'd save the GP's time who can use it to treat others. That's all it is. And people reading more into it are confusing rhetoric, which interviews are full of, and policy, for which you actually need to go to published proposals. I think the problem is that even politically interested people, they'll watch an interview and they'll think that what's been said is policy. It's like, no, sometimes it is, but the policy is written down. Can you be asked to go and look at the website or read the manifesto? Because that's where the policies are. But although I ordinarily have to point out when people who are politically interested keep confusing policy with rhetoric, I will say on this occasion, they've got a right to be miffed. Because when you're engaging in rhetoric, at least make it make sense. It can be vague, it can be ambiguous. In fact, it's an advantage if it is. But have it make sense. But like I say, this is just rhetoric to reach out to people they're just about interested enough in politics to vote, but not enough to actually read anything. It's just like Sunak's maths until 18 announcement. It's not a policy. There's no plan behind it. It's just a thing to say to get voters thinking in terms of this positive outcome. Part of the political game that you have to play if you want to win power. More interested observers will bemoan the frivolity and say, well, we should have more serious politicians. This is ridiculous, treating us like children. But that'll only happen when we have serious voters who don't want to be treated like children. After all, I don't think you could ever accuse Starmer of flights of fancy or whimsy. Whatever he is actually really serious to the point of being dour at times. If he's engaging in this nonsense, it's because it's strategic. He needs to. I just don't think it was a good example yesterday. But all the statement is saying is that Labour want to make sure that people can get quick access to healthcare. Rapid access, no messing about, no waiting, no being passed from pillar to post. That's all the policy is. As long as they deliver that, voters don't really care how it's done. Fortunately, the actual policies are easy to get on board with. Pushing aside all the bollocks in interviews, the definite policy announcements seem to be as follows. Main ones. First, knocking the waiting list down to a sensible level. Now, this is a policy because there's a plan. Not everyone likes the plan because it involves using quite a lot of private healthcare provision to achieve it. And although it will be right to make sure that this private provision is not baked in, that it is just used to deal with the necessary Tory backlog, it's nonetheless the case that there is no plan for getting rid of the backlog that doesn't involve private healthcare. So it's just one of those things we have to accept. It would take far too long to build up the capacity natural in the NHS, much longer than voters will give, more time than voters will give to Labour to get it done. But the policy of clearing the Tory backlog is not one that we oppose. It's not one I oppose, even if the method is as it is because it's the only one available. I will just, as I say, be keeping a careful eye on actual NHS investment. That is the boosting of nationalised provision that should run alongside private provision to clear the backlog until the NHS proper has the capacity to meet our needs. Whether that can be achieved before Labour are kicked out of power is another matter, hence bring proportional representation in place. But then the second policy, more recent one, to convert GPs from practice owners, partners or employees to all being NHS employees. Now, the way Streeting announced it was unnecessarily combative, aggressive and divisive, as he so often is. Yes, it's a policy likely to encounter resistance amongst doctors, but you don't just assume the resistance and come out fighting. Like, in some ways, it's not so bad, actually. I always think with Streeting, because he's a divisive little bugger, it's perhaps no bad thing that he's the shadow health secretary. You know, in other words, for the next Labour government, the health secretary. Starmer could have made him defence secretary. Can you imagine that? He'd probably start World War III. Although Starmer's language was less confrontational, I think, he has done nothing to muzzle Streeting with this attitude, which is disappointing, I say. You know, I wouldn't mind it so much if I could at least see some strategic use for it. But I really don't think that voters are desperate for politicians to pick a fight with doctors, I have to say. I'll also say that Starmer talked a lot of shit about GPs. He was saying, oh, they shouldn't need to be spending all this time working on their accounts, but delivering healthcare was like the implication. I'm thinking, do you think GPs do the accounts for their practice then? Well, what's that about? They don't. They employ practice managers. They deal with that. The GPs do deal with healthcare. They employ people to deal with that. They employ clerical staff to deal with the admin. You know, so even if GPs were all NHS employees, directly employed by the NHS, there'd still be like the equivalent practice manager doing that job, not the GPs. It's just that they too would be NHS employees, I guess. So the rhetoric in the interview is absolute cobblers. But as I say, you look past the language, which is there for casual observers, and look at the policy. The policy is to remove profit from the NHS. That's it. That's all it does. How would people who care about the NHS be opposed to that? Because what difference does it make to us if a GP practice is a private business owned by the partners, as it is now, and has been for decades, or an NHS centre employing the GPs directly? The difference is that it's cheaper to have the centres directly owned by the state instead of a group of doctors. So less of our healthcare funding is converted into profit. Now, I don't think this is going to be an easy policy to achieve, but I'm certainly not going to argue against the principle of the policy because it is converting more healthcare spending into healthcare outcomes instead of profit. So going back to that first policy, people are concerned that Labour may be using this Tory backlog as an excuse to bed in privatisation of the NHS, even under a Labour government. And ask yourself this, okay, so let us imagine you've got that suspicion. There's nothing wrong with having suspicions. Why would they now promote a policy that serves no purpose other than removing the draining away of NHS funding in the form of private profits? Because that's all this latest policy does. What this latest policy does, it reduces the level of privatisation in the NHS. But I think some are too blinded by a disdain for the way the current Labour leadership are handling several issues, and they don't seem to reflect on that. You know, the rhetoric is unfortunate, yes, and had better be purely strategic. But I'm not going to argue against any policy that reduces the level of public spending that disappears into the ether of profit. You know, some of it inevitably will do, but reduce the overall level and you get better outcomes for the same money. Mind you, I'd be very interested to see how Starmer and Streeting think they can succeed where Attlee and Bevan had to compromise quite heavily. But anyway, there we are. Those are my thoughts on the issue. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.